Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we travel beneath the silver moon of the ancient Silk Road, where caravans whispered secrets between empires, and the desert itself listened. No kings, no armies, just merchants trading silk for gold and rumors for eternity. Somewhere beyond the dunes, fires flicker, camels breathe, and hidden hands exchange messages that could change the course of history. You'll hear the quiet hum of the night market, the soft clink of jade, the scent of frankincense drifting through the wind. And somewhere in that stillness, the first global network of humanity was born. This isn't just a story about trade. It's about connection, trust, and the timeless hunger to be remembered by the stars. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe. But only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes and let the desert wind carry you back to the midnight caravans of the Silk Road. Under the pale moon over the dunes, caravans paused. What were they hiding? The desert was not silent, it breathed. Every grain of sand carried the memory of journeys long forgotten, of merchants and mystics who once traced this same path. The Silk Road, stretching like a golden vein across the spine of Asia, was never truly asleep. Even in the stillness of midnight, life pulsed beneath its skin. A soft wind rose from the west, brushing against the fabric of tents and the fur of resting camels. The smell of dry sage, mixed with faint traces of incense, drifted through the air. In the distance, a single oil lamp flickered, casting trembling shadows upon the dunes. Its light marked the camp of a caravan bound for Samarkand, a city said to hold the color of heaven in its domes. Beneath that lamp sat a traveler, neither young nor old, his face half hidden beneath a scarf faded by the desert sun. His eyes watched the horizon, though the horizon had vanished into darkness. He was known among the traders simply as the listener, for he rarely spoke. But at night he would close his eyes and listen to the breathing of the desert, to the murmurs that rose from the sand as if the earth itself whispered the secrets of empires past. Around him others slept uneasily. The guards leaned on their spears, half awake, their minds caught between vigilance and dream. Somewhere a camel groaned, a long hollow note that echoed like a song from the ancient world. The listener took a slow breath, his thoughts wandering to the endless journey behind him, from the salt plains of Dunhuang, across the high passes of the Pamir Mountains, through valleys lit by lanterns and markets that smelled of cardamom and sweat. Yet it was the night that fascinated him most, the hours when trade ceased and stories began. For under the cover of darkness, silk was not the only thing exchanged. There were maps drawn in invisible ink, promises whispered in forgotten tongues, and glances that carried the weight of entire kingdoms. Somewhere out there, beyond the dunes, other caravans traveled too. Persian, Chinese, Arab, each carrying not only goods, but fragments of belief, music, and myth. The desert was their witness, patient and vast. Every footprint would be erased by dawn, but the desert remembered everything. The listener tilted his head slightly, feeling the rhythm beneath the silence. It was faint, but real, a pulse hidden in the earth. Perhaps it was the slow heartbeat of the desert itself, or maybe it was only the echo of footsteps long gone. Every traveler who passed this way left something behind, though not always visible. A fragment of hope, a fragment of fear. The Silk Road was not merely a trade route. It was a river of human longing, flowing through emptiness. Above, the stars stretched in a grand procession, ancient and familiar. They had watched Alexander's armies cross these same dunes, had seen Buddhist monks carry scrolls from India to Chang'an, and later Arab scholars bringing back paper and philosophy. Under those same stars, the listener closed his eyes and imagined the unseen threads that connected them all. The merchants, the emperors, the wanderers like him. Somewhere out there beyond this night, those threads still moved, binding civilizations like silk. He could almost hear them vibrating. The camels stirred again, their shadows long and strange in the moonlight. One of the guards, a young Persian boy with tired eyes, approached the fire. "Can't sleep?" he whispered. The listener only smiled faintly. "No one truly sleeps here, not even the desert." The boy nodded as if he understood. Together they stared into the dying flame. The coals glowed like buried rubies, each breath of wind stirring their light. The listener's gaze softened. He thought of Samarkand, said to gleam like a jewel between mountains and sky. They said its bazaars smelled of rosewater and silk. Its scholars could read the stars as easily as books. For many, Samarkand was the dream at the end of the world. But for him, it was only another whisper on the wind, a promise the desert kept dangling just beyond reach. Somewhere out in the dunes, a jackal cried, breaking the stillness. Its voice was lonely, mournful, yet strangely beautiful, like the song of a flute carried across the sand. The listener felt something stir within him, a memory, maybe, or an omen. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small parchment wrapped in silk. Unfolding it, he revealed an old map drawn in fading ink. The roads twisted like veins, connecting distant lands. Kashgar, Merv, Nishapur, Damascus. Each name was a story, each route a gamble between fortune and oblivion. He traced one line gently with his finger, the path that led to Samarkand. The wind rose again, warmed this time, as if whispering encouragement. The listener smiled. In the desert, even the wind had a voice. The listener folded the map carefully and placed it back into his satchel. The parchment crackled softly, like dry leaves. Around him, the world had grown still again. The wind slowed to a sigh, The stars seemed to lower themselves closer to the dunes, and the fire had become nothing more than a circle of glowing embers, breathing in rhythm with the desert itself. He looked across the camp. Shapes of men and camels lay like gentle mounds of shadow, their movements synchronized with the pulse of the night. From somewhere within the dunes came the faint jingling of a bell, perhaps a camel that had wandered too far, or perhaps just the desert playing tricks on tired ears. The listener smiled faintly. He had traveled across too many miles to doubt the voice of the sands. Some said the desert spoke to those who had lost everything, offering them silence instead of answers. Others believed it was the earth's way of reminding humans how small they really were. The listener believed both. He lay back slowly, feeling the sand shift beneath him like water. The grains were cool, smooth, and ancient, shaped by countless nights like this one. Above him stretched infinity, the Milky Way a river of white fire, the constellations marking routes no caravan would ever dare follow. For a moment he felt himself dissolve into that vastness, neither traveler nor destination, only a part of the breathing world. He thought of the countless lives this road had seen, traders who carried silk and jade, monks with scrolls, soldiers with dreams of conquest, and lovers who whispered promises that faded with the dawn. All of them had looked up at these same stars, and all had eventually become dust, indistinguishable from the sand beneath him. And yet, he thought, that was the beauty of it. The Silk Road was not built by empires, but by moments, small, fragile, human moments stitched together across centuries. The night deepened. The young guard had fallen asleep, his head resting on his arm, a soft smile still on his face. The listener watched him for a while, then turned his gaze back to the stars. Perhaps, he murmured, this is what peace feels like. His voice vanished into the wind. In the distance, a dune collapsed with a soft hush, as if the desert itself exhaled. Soon, even that sound faded. The listener closed his eyes. The stars shimmered above, patient and eternal, while the desert wrapped its silence around every soul like a warm blanket. Somewhere, far off, another caravan began to move, its footsteps lost to time. When the first hour of night began to fade, the caravan stirred again. The desert, once a still ocean of silver sand, started to move, grain by grain, shadow by shadow. The listener rose from his mat, brushing off the fine dust that clung like memory. Around him, men whispered in low voices, tightening ropes, adjusting saddlebags. The camels groaned softly, their long necks swaying like ships in a dark sea. One by one, they stood, the small brass bells around their necks chiming faintly, a fragile rhythm echoing through the dunes. In the moonlight, it sounded almost like music, a secret melody played for no one but the stars. The caravan began to move, not quickly, but with an ancient patience, like time itself rolling forward. The listener walked near the front, his steps light, following the flicker of lanterns hung from the lead camel's saddle. Each flame trembled against the wind, drawing small halos on the sand. Behind him stretched a line of 20 camels, burdened with crates of silk, jade figurines, dried dates, and perhaps things never meant to be traded. The desert night was full of mysteries, and every shadow hid a story. The listener's gaze swept over the group. The traders' faces were calm, but their eyes told another tale. There was the merchant from Kashgar, whose left hand always hovered near his belt, as if guarding something precious. There was the woman veiled in indigo, riding a white camel, said to be the widow of a scholar from Bukhara. No one knew her true purpose, nor why she traveled alone. And there was the man with the scar across his jaw, silent but alert, who seemed to listen to the wind more than to words. The listener knew better than to ask. On the Silk Road, silence was often safer than truth. The dunes rose higher as they moved deeper into the night. The sand shimmered faintly beneath the moon, creating mirages that danced at the edge of sight. Cities of glass, rivers of light, all illusions born of exhaustion. Yet within those illusions, something real always lingered. The listener could almost feel the presence of those who had walked before, caravans from centuries past, still echoing through the dunes like ghosts made of dust. The moon hung low, and the air turned colder. Somewhere to the east, a star fell, burning briefly, vanishing into the horizon. The young Persian guard from before walked beside the listener, his eyes wide with awe. It's strange how quiet everything feels, even when we're moving. The listener nodded. The desert teaches quiet. Those who cannot listen to it are soon swallowed by it. They shared a brief glance, understanding without words. Around them the bells chimed again, soft, uncertain, like the heartbeat of the night itself. The dunes curved ahead like the spine of a sleeping beast. Each rise swallowed the moonlight. Each hollow returned it as silver shimmer. The caravan moved along that undulating path, its rhythm almost hypnotic. Soft sand beneath, pale stars above, the faint jingle of bells between. The listener found himself drifting in thought, as if the desert itself lulled his mind into a waking dream. Every sound carried meaning here. The breath of a camel, the creak of leather, the rustle of cloth. Each was a note in the symphony of survival. Then, amid that music, he noticed something else. A flicker, perhaps, or a glance that lingered too long. The woman in indigo rode a few paces ahead, her veil drawn low. Under the moonlight, her silhouette seemed carved from twilight itself. At one point, as her camel slowed, she turned her head slightly toward the listener. Her eyes met his, dark, unblinking, ancient as the road. And in that single look, he felt the weight of untold stories, grief, defiance, and a strange kind of peace. Before he could nod in greeting, she turned away again. The bells chimed, the sand whispered, and the moment was gone. Yet it left a tremor inside him, the kind that lingers long after sound fades. Behind them, the scarred man rode in silence, his hand resting casually on the hilt of a curved dagger. He hummed under his breath a melody that belonged to no known tongue. Every few moments he scanned the dunes, as if expecting someone or something to emerge. The listener sensed tension beneath the calm, like a bowstring drawn too tight. He wondered what treasures or secrets lay hidden inside the crates that swayed gently on the camels' backs. The Silk Road had carried not just silk and spice, but whispers, rumors of emperors' ransoms, sacred relics stolen from temples, forbidden letters written in invisible ink. Some said even the desert itself was paid to keep its silence. As the caravan climbed another ridge, the wind shifted. It brought with it a faint scent, something sweet, like amber mixed with smoke. The listener stopped, letting the others pass. He looked behind. Far across the dunes, a small flicker of orange danced. A fire. Not theirs. He frowned. No one was supposed to travel this route tonight. He motioned quietly to the Persian guard. The boy followed his gaze, eyes narrowing. "Another caravan?" he whispered. The listener shook his head slowly. "Or someone watching us." The words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. The wind died for a moment, as if the desert itself paused to listen. Then the bells rang again, soft and eerie, and the caravan pressed onward into the darkness. The dunes rose higher now, their ridges sharp against the dim horizon. The caravan moved slower, weighed down not only by cargo, but by unease. The listener could feel it in the air, that subtle shift when silence stops being peaceful and turns into listening. Every bell seemed louder, every footstep more deliberate. The moon hung low, brushing the dunes with light like liquid silver. He could see the faint glow of that distant fire again, now larger, pulsing like a heartbeat beyond the ridges. The scarred man urged his camel closer to the listener. "You saw it too?" he muttered. The listener nodded once. "We keep moving," the man said. "Stopping only makes us visible." His tone was steady, but his eyes darted restlessly toward the dark horizon. The veiled woman glanced back. Though her face was hidden, her posture spoke of quiet tension. Even the young Persian boy, usually curious, kept silent. The wind began to shift again. warmer this time, and with it came a whisper. It wasn't a voice exactly, more like the breath of the desert moving through hollows of sand. Yet to the listener, it sounded almost like words. "Keep walking, keep quiet," he thought he heard. He turned his gaze toward the dunes ahead, half expecting shapes to rise from the shadows. Nothing moved, and yet the feeling of being watched lingered, coiling around the edges of his awareness. Then, without warning, a bell broke free. One of the camels startled, jerking sideways with a deep groan. The caravan froze. The scarred man leapt down, hand on dagger, scanning the ridge. The listener caught sight of it then, a flicker of movement atop the dunes, brief as breath, gone the next instant. The night held its breath. "Sand thieves," the Persian boy whispered, "or ghosts." The listener's voice was calm. "It makes no difference. Both vanish with dawn." For a while, no one spoke. The caravan resumed its slow rhythm, the bells regaining their fragile melody. The fire behind the dunes dimmed, as if swallowed by distance, until it became just another trembling star. The listener exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment lift like sand caught by the wind. Around them, the desert began to hum again, the gentle pulse of the earth returning. Perhaps he thought that was all the desert demanded. Movement, not fear. To stand still was to invite the ghosts of the past to walk beside you. As the night deepened, the air grew colder. The camel's steps fell in rhythm with the wind, soft and endless. The woman in indigo began to hum, a low, ancient song that no one recognized, yet everyone understood. It wove through the caravan like a thread, binding them together in fragile peace. The listener closed his eyes, letting the sound carry him. The danger, the fire, the unseen watchers, all dissolved into the rhythm of sand and breath. And when he opened his eyes again, the horizon had softened. The first trace of dawn, pale and weightless, brushed against the dunes. The caravan was still moving, shadows fading as the light grew. Somewhere behind them, the desert kept its secrets. The bells chimed one last time, faint, tender, before the wind swallowed them whole. By the time the moon reached its highest point, the caravan had left the endless dunes behind. The sand gave way to hard-packed earth, scattered with dark shrubs and the faint shimmer of water. Ahead lay an oasis, small, hidden, almost shy beneath the weight of the desert sky. A few date palms leaned toward a pool that reflected the stars like broken mirrors. The listener knew this place. It wasn't marked on any map, but traders had whispered its name for centuries. Al-Hafa, the oasis of whispers. No one ruled it, yet every empire sent someone here to rest, to meet, to trade what could never be traded in daylight. As the camels knelt by the water's edge, the merchants began to unpack not their goods, but their secrets. The air changed here. It smelled of resin and amber,
of spices that once belonged to royal tables, and of something older, perhaps trust, perhaps deceit. The listener crouched beside the pool, dipping his hand into the cool water. Ripples spread, bending the reflection of the moon. He watched it shiver, thinking of how fragile truth always looked when touched. Around him, the others spoke in low tones. The woman in indigo had dismounted, her veil still drawn. She stood beneath a palm tree, speaking softly to a man wrapped in foreign silk. His accent carried hints of Persia and Byzantium. They exchanged a scroll bound with a red cord. The scarred man stood near them, eyes sharp, his dagger glinting faintly. He wasn't watching the trade, he was watching the silence. A silence that stretched like silk, thin but strong, dangerous to tear. The listener turned away, pretending not to notice. He had learned long ago that curiosity was a luxury too expensive for travelers. Still, his mind wandered. What kind of message would cross empires under moonlight? A treaty? A betrayal? Or simply a name? The desert had its own economy, one of whispers and half-truths, traded for survival. The Persian guard appeared beside him, holding a small cup of date wine. "For the cold," he said. The listener accepted it. The drink was warm, earthy, carrying the taste of forgotten fruit. "This place," the boy said, after a pause, "feels alive." The listener nodded. "Because it listens. Every word said here sinks into the sand. That's why traders come back, not for water, but to be heard by something older than kings." The boy frowned, uncertain whether he believed it, but the listener smiled, eyes drifting toward the figures by the fire. More traders had gathered, Turks, Indians, even a man whose armor gleamed faintly Roman. Around the fire, hands moved quickly, passing pouches, stones, folded paper. Gold was exchanged, yes, but it was the glances, the nods, the silence between breaths that truly held value. The fire crackled, throwing shadows across their faces. The oasis had become a marketplace of ghosts, and above it all, the desert wind whispered, as if to remind them, nothing traded here ever truly leaves this place.
The night at Al-Hafa deepened, and the fire grew smaller, its embers glowing like the eyes of watchful spirits. The listener sat on a low stone, his back warmed by the flames, his face cooled by the wind that carried scents of resin and smoke. Around him, voices rose and fell like the tide. Brief negotiations, laughter without joy, promises made too easily. Every tone was a currency, every silence a transaction. He knew that somewhere among these traders, history itself was being rewritten, one exchange at a time. The woman in indigo had vanished into the shadows, and in her place came another, a stranger cloaked in sand-colored robes. His face was mostly hidden, save for a line of pale beard and a single gold ring on his thumb. The scarred man noticed him first, stepping forward. "You came late," he said. The stranger's voice was calm, almost weary. The desert decides when a man arrives. He removed a small pouch from his robe and held it out. The listener caught a glimpse. Not coins, not gems, but something that shimmered like dust under moonlight. Fine grains, each one glowing faintly blue. The traders around the fire fell silent. "What is it?" someone whispered. The stranger smiled. "The last light from Alexandria," he said softly, "captured in glass before the library burned." The words rippled through the camp. Even the wind seemed to pause. The listener watched as the woman in indigo reappeared, stepping from the shadows like smoke. "You risk your life bringing that here," she said. The stranger met her gaze. "Knowledge dies faster in silence. I'd rather sell it to those who still remember what light means." His tone was neither proud nor fearful, only tired, as if he had walked too long carrying something sacred. The scarred man gestured impatiently. "Enough riddles! Show it!" The stranger knelt by the fire, untied the pouch, and poured a small mound of blue dust onto a flat stone. It glowed faintly, illuminating the lines of his hands. For a moment, the oasis seemed to breathe. The color shifted. Sapphire, then silver, then gold. It wasn't light exactly, but memory, shimmering like thought given form. The listener leaned forward, unable to look away. In that glow, he saw shapes, towers, scrolls, faces of scholars long dead. Knowledge trapped in grains of sand. He realized what this truly was. Fragments of melted glass from the great library, fused with ink and ash. A relic of human thought, sold beneath the stars. The traders began murmuring again, voices trembling. Some offered silver, others gold, but the stranger shook his head. "I don't sell to the highest bidder, only to the one who will carry it forward." The woman in indigo looked at him long and quietly. Then, without speaking, she placed a small golden seal on the stone, the emblem of Samarkand's Scholars Guild. The firelight caught it, and for an instant the whole camp glowed like a constellation reborn. The blue dust glowed faintly on the stone, pulsing like a fragile heart. For a moment, no one moved. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere behind them a camel sighed, its breath curling like smoke. The woman in indigo reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the edge of the glowing sand. It did not burn. Instead, it shimmered around her fingers as though recognizing her. "How much?" asked the scarred man, his voice rough with impatience. The stranger smiled faintly. "Everything worth remembering has already been paid for," he said. "You only decide who forgets." He poured the dust back into its pouch and tied it with a red string identical to the one that bound the scroll earlier.
The gesture was deliberate, ceremonial. "Then it's done," the woman said quietly. She passed the golden seal to him, and in that instant the fire flared as if acknowledging their pact. The flames rose, casting brief halos around their faces, a silent witness to the exchange. The listener watched without blinking. There was no greed here, no triumph, only reverence. The trade had ended, yet no one seemed relieved. The stranger stood, bowed once to the circle, and turned toward the dunes. His shadow stretched long, merging with the night. "He's leaving alone?" the Persian boy whispered. The listener nodded. "No one owns what he carries." The stranger paused at the edge of the firelight. "When dawn comes," he said, "bury the ashes. Let no one trace what was said tonight." Then he disappeared into the dark, his footsteps erased almost instantly by the wind. The caravan fell silent. Only the fire spoke now, popping softly, its embers dimming with every breath. The woman in indigo remained seated, staring into the empty air where the stranger had stood. "Every trade," she murmured, "takes something unseen." The listener turned to her. "And what did he take tonight?" She looked up. "Our certainty." The words lingered, heavier than smoke. The scarred man threw sand onto the fire, and the light died with a sigh. In the darkness, the oasis seemed to vanish. Only the faint reflection of stars rippled across the pool. The listener sat quietly, feeling the chill creep into his bones. Around him, the traders began to disperse, returning to their tents, their secrets tucked tightly away. He stayed by the dying fire. His thoughts wandered to Alexandria, to the burned library, to the fragments of knowledge turned to glass. He imagined those grains of blue dust scattered again across the desert, carried by the wind into new hands, new minds. Perhaps that was the true Silk Road, not a path of commerce, but of memory, weaving humanity together through the fragile trade of remembrance. The wind sighed once more, brushing the last embers into darkness. The listener rose, feeling the night stretch endlessly above him. Somewhere beyond the dunes, the stranger was already gone, the woman asleep, the world unchanged, and yet something unseen had shifted. The desert had listened, and now it remembered.
The desert slept, but not soundly. As the caravan moved away from the oasis, the air felt heavier, thick with secrets that refused to fade. Behind them, Al-Hafa was already swallowed by the horizon, its palms turned to silhouettes, its fire to memory. The listener walked in silence, his thoughts tangled like the lines of an unrolled map. He could still see the blue dust shimmering on the stone, the glow lingering in his mind like an after-image of truth. But truth, he knew, never stayed where men left it. The camels trudged on, bells chiming with the rhythm of weariness. The woman in indigo rode ahead, her posture straight, her eyes lost somewhere between vigilance and thought. The Persian boy followed close behind her, glancing often toward the dunes, as if the night itself might reach out and take him. The scarred man rode to the rear, silent, hand always near the hilt of his blade. The listener felt the tension pulling the air tight between them. Something unseen had shifted since the trade, a silence thicker than before, heavy not with rest, but with waiting. The moon climbed higher, thin and cold. Its light spilled over the dunes like liquid silver, revealing the faint trail of another caravan that had passed days ago, or perhaps only hours. The listener crouched, touching the prints. They were fresh, too fresh. "We're not alone," he murmured. The scarred man dismounted, running his fingers through the sand. "Tracks lead east," he said, "toward the borderlands." The listener's eyes narrowed. The eastern border meant only one thing: the frontier between empires. He rose slowly, his gaze sweeping the horizon. In the stillness, he thought he heard something. Not wind, not bells, but voices carried from afar, faint as breath, words he couldn't yet understand. He turned to the woman in indigo. "Did you hear that?" She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled a small bronze disc from her sleeve, engraved with markings too fine to read in the dark. She held it toward the moonlight. The metal caught the light, revealing a symbol: two intertwined serpents, one silver, one black. The listener felt a chill trace his spine. He had seen that mark once before, on a letter intercepted in Dunhuang, a message rumored to predict war between the East and the West. "You carry their seal?" he asked quietly. The woman met his eyes, her gaze calm but unreadable. "I carry messages. I don't choose their senders." The Persian boy frowned. Then tonight's trade was not about silk, she finished. The words fell like stones into a well, swallowed by the night. The listener turned his head toward the dunes. The wind had picked up again, whispering through the hollows, shaping words that almost sounded human. He couldn't tell whether it was imagination or warning. In the distance, a faint glimmer of light flickered, too steady to be stars, too far to be fire. He watched it pulse once, then vanish. The desert, it seemed, was still listening. The night grew colder, yet the air seemed alive, charged with something unseen. The listener walked beside the lead camel, his eyes drawn again and again to that faint light flickering beyond the dunes. It wasn't constant, appearing, vanishing, then pulsing once more, like a distant heartbeat. He knew enough of desert codes to recognize it. Signal fire. Someone was sending a message. The woman in indigo noticed his glance and spoke softly without turning. "You shouldn't look too long," she said. "They might take your gaze as an answer." Her tone was calm, but her words landed heavy. The Persian boy frowned, whispering, "Who are they?" "Messengers or spies, sometimes both." Her voice carried no fear, only fatigue, as though she had walked too many nights beneath too many watchful stars. The listener's curiosity burned quietly within him. He had followed caravans for years, learning languages of trade, prayer, and silence, but never this one. A language written in fire, wind, and shadow. He slowed his pace, letting the others drift ahead. Then he saw it clearly, the pattern of the flickers. 3 short bursts, a pause, 2 long, 1 short. A rhythm, deliberate and precise, not random. "It's code," he murmured. The scarred man turned sharply. "You can read it?" The listener hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Old Khwarezmian. I've seen monks use it near the Oxus River." "And what does it say?" the boy asked. The listener's gaze fixed on the horizon, watching as the light blinked again. "It says, 'The wings are ready.'" The words sent a chill through the camp. The scarred man spat into the sand, a war phrase used by envoys before invasion. The woman in indigo turned toward the listener then, her eyes dark beneath the veil. "You shouldn't understand too much for a traveler." Her tone wasn't accusation, but warning. The listener met her gaze calmly. "And you hide too much for a widow." For a moment, the air between them seemed to tighten. The wind paused, the camels stopped breathing. Then she looked away, breaking the tension. "What you heard tonight is not yours to carry. Forget it before dawn." "I've heard many things," he replied quietly. "The desert keeps most of them, but not all," she whispered. Her voice was softer now, almost kind. "Some things the desert remembers, and so do men who listen too closely." The words sank into him like sand into water, silent but heavy. He wanted to ask more, but before he could, the light vanished completely. No flicker, no trace. The dunes turned dark once again, as if the night itself had sealed its lips. The caravan moved on, but the silence felt different now, thicker, aware. The listener knew what it meant. Somewhere beyond those dunes, another caravan had received the same signal. Somewhere, plans were already in motion. The night pressed on, colder and quieter than before. The dunes looked frozen beneath the moon, as if time itself had paused to listen. The listener felt the rhythm of his steps fade into the sand, swallowed by the stillness. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, heavy with things unspoken. He could feel it surrounding the caravan, a shroud woven from all the words they dared not say. Somewhere ahead, the woman in indigo hummed softly again, that same low melody she had sung before. But now it sounded different, slower, sadder, carrying a weight of farewell. The Persian boy whispered, "She's praying." The listener shook his head gently. "No, she's remembering." He looked up. The stars above the desert seemed to pulse faintly, their light trembling, as if the heavens themselves were uneasy. The scarred man called quietly from the rear, "Movement, East Ridge." The caravan halted. The listener strained his eyes and saw them, faint shadows moving along the ridge, too small to be dunes, too smooth to be rock. Riders, half a dozen, maybe more. They made no sound, no light, yet their presence was unmistakable. The woman in indigo dismounted. Her voice, when it came, was calm as sand. "They are messengers of the Black Serpent. They guard the silence of those who trade with kings." The Persian boy's hand went to his knife. "Are we in danger?" "No," she said. "Not if we keep moving." The listener studied her face, though her veil still hid it. "You knew they'd be here." She didn't answer. Instead, she took a small wooden tablet from her satchel and pressed it into his palm. It was carved with intricate lines and filled with tiny symbols. "If I don't return to Samarkand," she whispered, "give this to the scribes at the Blue Dome. Tell them the wings are ready, and that the wind will rise within 3 moons." "What does it mean?" he asked. She smiled behind the veil, a sad smile that never reached her eyes. "History is already awake." Then she turned, mounted her camel, and urged the caravan onward. The dunes swallowed their tracks quickly, the moon bleaching everything into shades of silver and silence. But the listener lingered for a moment longer, the tablet heavy in his hand. He could feel the grooves of its carvings, the echo of words meant for others, centuries in the making. Somewhere behind him, the watchers on the ridge melted back into the darkness. He looked up at the sky, a vault of pale fire stretching forever, and spoke softly, though no one was near. "What do you remember, old desert?" His voice was small against the vastness. The wind replied, whispering low and endless, its tone neither kind nor cruel. It sounded almost human, almost knowing. The listener closed his eyes, letting it wash over him. For a moment, he imagined the sand speaking in languages older than any empire, a chorus of forgotten merchants, soldiers, and dreamers whose footsteps were still buried beneath his. Each grain of sand a story, each gust of wind a memory retold. When he opened his eyes, the moon had dipped lower, and the caravan was already distant, a line of shadows dissolving into dawn. He tucked the tablet into his cloak and began to walk, slow and steady, feeling the desert breathe around him once more. The night had spoken, and though its words were beyond his understanding, he knew they would find him again. For those who listen, the desert never stops speaking. Dawn was slow to arrive, dragging its pale light over the dunes like silk unraveling from the night. The caravan had halted to rest near a cluster of stones that marked the edge of the old trade route. The listener sat alone, watching the horizon shift from silver to rose. The desert at sunrise always looked gentler than it truly was, a soft illusion before the heat returned to reclaim its throne. He took the wooden tablet from his cloak and turned it in his hands. The carvings caught the light, revealing lines that seemed to move when viewed too long. He could not read the script, but he felt its weight, the kind of meaning that didn't need translation. Behind him, the Persian boy was tending to the camels, humming softly. The woman in indigo had withdrawn to her tent, silent since the night's encounter, and the scarred man was sharpening his blade in rhythm with his breath, each motion steady, ritualistic. The listener closed his eyes, letting the morning wind cool his thoughts. Then he heard it, the sound of hooves, faint at first, then clearer, carrying from the east. The rhythm was wrong for a caravan, too swift, too singular. He stood, scanning the horizon. A lone rider emerged from the haze, wrapped in a cloak of deep blue that shimmered like water under the rising sun. The listener's heart quickened. He remembered that color, the same hue as twilight over the dunes, the same cloak worn by the man who had once whispered, "Tonight, the desert will keep silent." The rider slowed as he approached, dismounting with fluid grace. His face was hidden beneath the hood, but his voice, when it came, was unmistakable, calm, resonant, and edged with knowing. The silence has ended. The listener said nothing. The scarred man rose, hand on his weapon, but the stranger raised a gloved hand. "I bring no harm, only a warning." He turned his gaze toward the eastern horizon, where the light was brightening into gold. "The wind is shifting. Within 3 moons, the roads will no longer be safe. Empires are waking." The woman in indigo stepped out from her tent. Her veil fluttered slightly in the morning air. "You again," she said. "I thought the desert had taken you." The stranger inclined his head. "It did, but the desert returns what it cannot keep." His words hung in the air like sand suspended in wind. The listener studied him closely. Beneath the blue cloak, a faint glint, metal perhaps, or something older. "Why come back now?" he asked. The stranger's eyes, pale, unreadable, met his. "Because what was traded last night is no longer secret. The serpents have stirred. You are being followed." A ripple went through the group, small but sharp. The scarred man cursed under his breath. The Persian boy stopped moving altogether. The woman's hands tightened around her veil. The listener's voice was low, deliberate. "Who told you this?" The stranger smiled faintly. "The desert," he said. "It remembers faster than men forget."
The wind had begun to rise, swirling around them with grains of fine sand that glittered like powdered gold. The listener shielded his eyes, but the man in the blue cloak stood unmoved, his figure cutting sharply against the pale horizon. "You said we're being followed," the listener said. "By whom?" The stranger turned to face him fully. "By those who think knowledge is a weapon, and those who wish to bury it." He reached into his cloak and pulled out a folded cloth, dark and worn, edges frayed from time. He laid it upon the sand. It wasn't cloth at all, but thin parchment, scorched in places, as if touched by fire. "This," he said softly, "is what remains of the map of ash." The Persian boy stepped closer, curious. "A map to where?" "Not where," the stranger replied. "When?" His words fell like pebbles into silence. The listener frowned, uncertain he had heard correctly. The woman in indigo moved nearer, eyes narrowing. "You mean it marks time?" The man nodded. "It was drawn in Alexandria before the flames took it. Each line traces not land, but the pulse of empires, their rise, their silence, their fall. When the ashes settled, fragments were scattered along the trade routes. I've spent half a life piecing them together." He traced his finger across the parchment, revealing faint sigils glowing faintly beneath the morning light. "These roots," he continued, "once connected more than cities. They connected fates." The listener crouched beside him, studying the faint burn marks. "And last night's trade was one of those fragments." "Yes," said the stranger, "a shard of memory. The woman you travel with carries it still, but she does not yet know what she awakens." The woman's gaze hardened. "And you think you do?" The stranger's tone was calm. "I've seen it before. When the dust begins to glow, war always follows." A gust of wind tore across the dunes, lifting the edge of the parchment. For a heartbeat, the listener saw shapes beneath it, cities dissolving into sand, rivers turning black, constellations shifting. Then it was gone. The man folded the map again, tucking it beneath his cloak. "There are those who would kill to silence this, and those who would die to hear it." "And you?" the listener asked. "I am only the echo," he answered. "I was once a scholar before books became dangerous." His eyes softened briefly, "before truth became a kind of treason." The woman in indigo studied him in silence. Then she said quietly, "If your map shows time, what comes next?" The stranger looked east toward the rising sun. "A storm," he said, "made not of sand, but of men." The wind grew restless. It swept across the dunes in long, low sighs, carrying with it the scent of copper and storm. The listener watched as the horizon dimmed again, though the sun still hung low above it. "It shouldn't be this dark," the Persian boy murmured. The man in the blue cloak turned sharply toward the parchment, still lying between them. The edges of the map of ash had begun to curl upward, trembling.
A faint glow seeped from its veins, thin like smoke made of light. "Don't touch it," he said quickly. "It's waking." The listener knelt, his breath shallow. The faint sigils across the surface began to move, rearranging themselves as though remembering. The light grew brighter, pulsing in rhythm, not random, but alive, almost breathing. "What's happening?" the woman in indigo demanded. Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed something else. Fear, old and familiar. The stranger replied quietly, "It remembers the pattern of fire." The scarred man took a step back. "You mean the fall?" "Every fall," said the stranger. The glow flared suddenly, and the wind howled. The wind grew restless. It swept across the dunes in long, low sighs, carrying with it the scent of copper and storm. The listener watched as the horizon dimmed again, though the sun still hung low above it. "It shouldn't be this dark," the Persian boy murmured. The man in the blue cloak turned sharply toward the parchment still lying between them. The edges of the map of ash had begun to curl upward, trembling. A faint glow seeped from its veins, thin like smoke made of light. "Don't touch it," he said quickly. "It's waking." The listener knelt, his breath shallow. The faint sigils across the surface began to move, rearranging themselves as though remembering. The light grew brighter, pulsing in rhythm, not random, but alive, almost breathing. "What's happening?" the woman in indigo demanded. Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed something else, fear, old and familiar. The stranger replied quietly, "It remembers the pattern of fire." The scarred man took a step back. "You mean the fall?" "Every fall," said the stranger. The glow flared suddenly, and the wind howled as if the desert itself cried out. The listener felt the sand shudder beneath him. The dunes rippled like water. He heard whispers, not of men, but of memory, fragments of languages he didn't know, prayers, bargains, screams swallowed by centuries. The woman clutched her veil. "It's showing us the past," said the listener softly. But the stranger shook his head. "No, the warning." The Persian boy shouted, pointing east. A black line had appeared on the horizon, moving fast. Not a cloud, not shadow, but dust raised by hooves. Riders, dozens, maybe hundreds. The woman turned to the stranger. "You led them here." "No," he said. "The map did." The listener grabbed the parchment, folding it before the light consumed it whole. The glow flickered, then died. The air fell silent, heavy, thick with the taste of metal. The stranger looked toward the oncoming storm. "It's too late to hide. They already know who carries it." The woman's voice was low. "Then we run." The scarred man didn't wait for agreement. "Pack the beasts," he barked. The Persian boy stumbled into motion, fastening the saddles with trembling hands. The listener tucked the parchment deep beneath his cloak. It felt warm, almost pulsing like a heartbeat against his chest. The blue-cloaked man mounted his horse again, his voice cutting through the rising wind. "Head north, toward the Valley of Mirrors. The dunes there can hide your scent." "And you," the listener called out. The stranger smiled faintly beneath his hood. "I was never meant to leave this desert."
His horse reared, the cloak flaring like a fragment of twilight. "Go!" he shouted, and before they could answer, he rode east, straight toward the black horizon. For a heartbeat, he looked like a shard of the night itself, vanishing into what awaited. The listener turned, urging his camel into motion. The caravan broke into the storm, swallowed by rising walls of dust and light. The desert screamed, and the map beneath his cloak began to hum, softly, steadily, like the breath of something that had just awakened after 1,000 years.
The desert had turned into a moving sea. Waves of sand rose and crashed under a sky the color of tarnished bronze. The listener could barely see the camel ahead of him, only the brief flicker of a lantern swinging wildly in the storm. The air burned his throat. The wind screamed like 1,000 whispering voices. Every grain of sand carried heat and memory. He pulled his cloak tighter, pressing forward, each step a battle against the invisible weight of the storm. The women in indigo rode ahead, her figure almost spectral in the golden haze. The Persian boy clung to his saddle, his eyes wide with terror, while the scarred man shouted directions that vanished instantly into the roar. The storm had no direction. It swallowed north, south, east, and west alike. "Keep close," the listener shouted, though his words were snatched away by the wind. Above the chaos, thunder rolled, not the thunder of rain, but of shifting dunes and distant collapse. And beneath it, faint but rising, came another sound, the rhythm of hooves. The listener turned, heart tightening. Through the curtain of dust, he saw shadows, riders, faceless, gliding across the storm as if the wind itself obeyed them. Not men, but echoes, ghosts of forgotten armies. Their armor shimmered like molten bronze, their banners tattered, but glowing faintly with symbols of vanished empires. Babylon, Persia, Rome. Each crest flickered, half memory, half myth. The woman looked back once, her voice a whisper swallowed by wind. "They're not chasing us, they're remembering." The listener understood. The storm was not only air and sand, it was history itself exhaling. The map of ash against his chest grew warm again, pulsing in time with the storm's breath. He could feel something inside it awaken, not light, but memory taking form. The dunes beneath them shifted violently, and suddenly the horizon split open. For an instant, the listener saw an impossible sight. A city of white marble rising from the sands, its towers gleaming, its streets alive with fire and procession. He blinked, and it was gone, replaced by emptiness. The scarred man cursed, dragging his camel away from a collapsing ridge. "This isn't weather," he shouted. "It's the past." The listener gritted his teeth. "No," he said softly, "it's what the past leaves behind." The woman raised her hand, eyes fixed on something unseen. "Listen," she whispered.
Through the roar there was a pattern, not chaos, but rhythm, a heartbeat too steady for chance. The listener felt it too. The storm wasn't random, it was leading them somewhere. He gripped the reins tighter, forcing his voice through the wind. "Follow the sound!" The caravan turned, struggling through the violent haze, guided not by sight, but by vibration, by the ancient pulse of empires long gone. The storm did not fade, it transformed. As they pushed deeper into the wasteland, the wind began to change pitch. No longer a scream, but a chorus. The air shimmered, bending light into ripples. Ahead, the dunes flattened into a vast hollow, polished smooth as glass. The listener reined in his camel, staring in disbelief. The desert here reflected the sky perfectly, turning the world upside down. It was as though they had entered a valley made not of sand, but of mirrors. "This is the place he spoke of," said the woman in indigo. Her voice trembled with something not quite fear. Reverence, perhaps. The scarred man spat into the sand, but his spit left no mark. The grains swallowed everything. "Looks cursed," he muttered. The Persian boy whispered a prayer under his breath. The listener dismounted slowly. The sand beneath his boots was cool, too cool. And when he stepped forward, his reflection stepped with him, clear and alive, as if watching. "It's not glass," he murmured. "It's memory." The woman turned sharply. "What did you say?" "This place," he said, "it's where time folds. Every grain remembers what it once touched." The woman hesitated, then knelt, brushing her hand across the ground. Instantly, the surface rippled, and the valley came alive. Towers rose from reflection, faint but towering. Ships of gold drifted across invisible seas. Temples shimmered in the distance, their walls engraved with languages long dead. The listener's breath caught. "Empires," he whispered. "All of them." The woman nodded slowly. "The storm brings them back, not to stay, but to be seen." Above them, lightning flickered silently, illuminating armies frozen in motion. Persian lancers, Roman legions, caravans laden with silk, all marching across the valley of glass. But none of them cast shadows. "They're echoes," said the Persian boy, "like dreams left behind." The listener turned toward the woman. "Why bring us here?" She looked toward the far ridge, her eyes reflecting the shimmering horizon. "Because the desert remembers faster than men forget," she said, repeating the words once spoken by the man in blue. The listener's pulse quickened. "You knew him better than you said." She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her cloak and drew out something small, a fragment of glass, dull and blackened. When she held it up to the sky, it caught the lightning and flared alive, glowing deep blue, the same color as the cloak. He left this, she said, before he rode east. The scarred man frowned. A relic? A key, she whispered. To what? Asked the listener. To what the storm hides. Then, as if summoned by her words, the wind shifted again. The dunes shuddered, the mirrored valley rippling like disturbed water. From the far horizon came a faint, rhythmic tremor, not thunder, but footsteps, countless and steady. The reflection of the valley darkened, and in it shapes began to rise. Not echoes this time, but figures, solid, walking, cloaked, armored, ancient, and all turning their faces toward the living.
The figures rose slowly from the mirrored sand, like memories climbing out of the mind of the world. At first, they were translucent, fragile as breath. Then their forms solidified. Armor glinted under the ghost light of the storm. Faces emerged, some proud, some broken, all forgotten. Kings and soldiers, merchants and slaves, poets and wanderers. The listener stood frozen. The woman in indigo stepped forward, the blue shard still glowing in her hand. Its light drew the figures nearer. They did not walk, they drifted, their steps leaving no mark. One of them, a tall man in a crown of bronze, raised his hand toward her, his mouth moving soundlessly. The listener strained to hear, but the storm swallowed the words. Then, faintly, he heard it, not through his ears, but through the trembling in the sand beneath his feet. A voice, ancient and vast. We are not gone. We are waiting. The woman's eyes widened. They're speaking. The listener nodded. They remember. The crowned man pointed toward the listener, then to the shard. He calls you, she said softly. The listener stepped forward, his heart pounding. The figure's eyes followed him as he approached. The storm's wind bent around him, whispering his name. Not the one he bore, but the one he had forgotten. He knelt beside the nearest reflection. What do you want from me? The answer came as a vibration in the air, in the bones, in the sand itself. Carry us. The listener hesitated. Carry what? The voice deepened, resonating through every grain of the desert. Our silence. And then, as if the very word had power, the valley erupted in light. The mirrored dunes flared with impossible brilliance, each reflection becoming a world unto itself. Babylon burning, Rome collapsing, Samarkand rising like a jewel. Time fractured, looping endlessly in the glass. The woman cried out, shielding her face. The Persian boy fell to his knees, sobbing. The scarred man drew his dagger as if to strike the visions themselves. But the listener did not move. He stood amidst the ages of storm, eyes wide open, the blue shard blazing in his hand. The wind tore through his cloak, yet around him the air stilled, as though the storm itself paused to listen. He heard every whisper, every prayer, every breath that history had buried. And then, like a tide receding, the light began to fade. The figures dissolved one by one, their forms turning back to dust, their faces peaceful. The crowned man bowed once before vanishing.
The last words drifted to him like dying embers. When the silence returns, remember us. The valley went dark. Only the wind remained. The listener fell to his knees, clutching the shard. Its glow dimmed until it was no brighter than a star's reflection. The woman approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What did they say?" she whispered. His voice trembled. "They asked me to listen." She frowned, not understanding, but he looked out over the dunes where dawn was breaking, soft, golden, and fragile. The storm isn't just destruction, it's remembrance. The empires die so the memory can breathe again. He rose slowly, his gaze steady. "I know what I must do now." "And what is that?" asked the woman. The listener turned to her, eyes glimmering like sand under morning light. "To become what the desert made me, the keeper of silence."
Dawn did not arrive so much as it returned, shy and unsure, like a traveler who had lost the road in the night and found it again by accident. The storm had emptied itself across the desert and moved on, leaving behind a world reduced to first principles: light, wind, silence. The dunes were no longer waves but graves, smooth, swollen shapes that hid what they had taken. The caravan's footprints had been licked away. The listener stood where the valley had been and saw only a plain of pale ash-colored sand, as if the desert had exhaled all memory and now held its breath. Around him, survivors gathered like commas in a sentence that no longer knew how to end. The woman in indigo with dust stitched into her veil, the Persian boy with salt on his lashes that might have been tears or sand, the scarred man whose blade for once hung stupid and dull at his side. The wind had softened to a whisper that seemed to apologize for the night. No one spoke. Their voices would have sounded rude in a place that had fought so hard to be quiet. The listener moved carefully, as if stepping on paper, and a strange tenderness came over him, toward the camels who had not run, toward the men who were not here to count themselves lucky, toward the desert itself, who had done what deserts do and asked no forgiveness. He knelt to check a broken girth strap, and his hand vanished into the sand up to the wrist. When he pulled back, the sand came with him, a small collapse like a sigh, and something thin and stiff scraped his palm. He brushed gently and uncovered the corner of a scroll, edges scalloped by time, the surface tattooed with powder-fine dust that would not leave it. He felt the old thrill, the one that is half fear, half gratitude, then teased it free. The parchment uncurled with the hush of a dried leaf. The smell rose first, a tempered alchemy of resin and smoke and the sweet musk of libraries long gone. In the milk light of morning, the inks were not black but brown, then a quiet red. Seals. He leaned closer. Where a cartographer might draw rivers and cities, this hand had written currents of meaning, the thin brush running like water, settling into ideograms that looked as if they had learned to breathe. Near the top, impressed so deep it made its own light, a round imperial seal, a coiling dragon, twin pearls, the characters for tongue carved with ceremonious calm. The listener felt the hairs on his arms rise. He knew the legend whispered by night wagons and roadside fires that during the fullness of the Tang, librarians in Chang'an charted not just the earth, but the movement of knowledge itself, mapping where words were born, which roads carried them, the markets that bent their tone, and the deserts that tried to swallow them. He raised the scroll, and the light quickened across it. No mountains, no borders, only lattices of strokes that suggested routes of sound rather than stone. He glanced up. The woman had drawn closer, the boy behind her, and even the scarred man abandoned his blade to his pocket of silence. "What is it?" the boy asked, his voice already lowering itself as if the document could be startled. "A map," the listener said, "but not of places." He traced a breath over a column, not daring to touch. The characters carried a music he could not read but almost heard. North-south syllables braided with west-east scripts, a notation of exchange written in a grammar of crossings. "It marks where speech travels," he murmured, "and where it changes shape to survive." The woman in indigo leaned in, and for a second the blue shard she kept, the relic left by the man in the cloak, caught the same light the scroll was drinking and answered faintly, like two tuning forks agreeing. The listener swallowed. The desert had offered him broken armies and unbroken wind, and now it offered something softer, more dangerous, a way to find where words refuse to die. He thought of the map of ash, of blue dust that glowed with burned remembrance, and felt a thin seam opening between the two, like the stitch between pulse and breath. Behind his ribs, a memory moved. In the storm's heart, a crown of bronze tilting, a voice that had no mouth saying, "Carry us." He lowered the scroll. "Is this what they hid?" he asked the sand, meaning the empires, the envoys, the men who bought silence by the mile. The wind passed over the dunes and did not disagree. Somewhere a camel groaned like a door learning to open. He looked again at the seal. Tang, that dynasty of deliberate beauty, and understood that what endured was not rule but route, the way knowledge practiced its own survival. The scarred man shifted. "If writers come back," he said, "they'll smell ink before blood." The listener nodded. "Then we'll fold it into breath." The Persian boy frowned, not understanding, and the woman's eyes softened with the fatigue of having to. The listener rolled the parchment until it was a narrow heart and slid it inside his cloak against the map of ash that still slept there like a cooled ember. For a moment the two warmed together. He felt the heat and a certainty that made him both lighter and less free. In the slack quiet after catastrophe, the world often seems newly made, but it is only newly named. He lifted his head to the paling sky, to the desert that had emptied itself to show him something that was not emptiness, and thought, not without wonder, perhaps the road he had walked was not for silk, nor even for memory, but for the grammar of remembering.
He touched the fold over his chest as if greeting a bird that had chosen him, and the question rose of its own accord, tender as injury. What if this is what they were hiding? Not a path to glory, but a pattern for keeping voices alive.
At dusk, the desert changed color again, from pale gold to rose gray, from rose gray to a kind of silence the eyes could almost hear. The survivors had built a small fire from broken saddles and sandalwood crumbs, its smoke climbing like a thread between two worlds. Around it, the wind no longer wandered. It seemed to circle and listen. The listener spread the tame scroll on a flat stone and pressed its corners with pebbles. It looked fragile now, yet there was a pulse beneath the parchment, faint, deliberate, steady. The woman in indigo sat opposite him, her face drawn by the orange light. The Persian boy dozed against a saddle. The scarred man had vanished into the dark, muttering about finding water, or perhaps courage. The listener traced one finger above the scroll, not touching, only hovering as one might over the skin of a sleeping animal. The brushstrokes stirred, not visibly, but in the way a scent stirs memory. He thought he heard voices, not words, not yet, but cadences, fragments of speech that had once crossed these sands. Chinese merchants haggling over silk in broken Sogdian, a monk from Gandhara whispering sutras in Sanskrit, a Roman envoy arguing in Greek, and beneath them all the undertone of the desert itself, that low, patient hum that made every language equal. He leaned closer, and the scroll warmed under his breath. A line of ink shimmered, bled into another, and then rearranged itself into shapes he did not know. The letters pulsed, and when he blinked, they seemed to have moved again. The woman gasped softly. "Did you see?" she asked. He nodded. "It's not writing," he murmured. "It's remembering." And as he spoke, sound began to bloom. Not loud, a whisper, a weaving. The air above the parchment rippled like heat over sand. From it came murmurs, laughter, orders, sighs, the layered chorus of civilizations trading not just goods, but thought. The listener's eyes filled. "It's their voices," he said. The woman touched her throat as if to keep from answering too loudly. The voices merged, climbed, and then thinned into one long tone, clear and impossible, a note that felt older than the wind. The tang seal glowed, then cracked the faintest line. A beam of light slid from it and painted the sand in front of them with a single path of gold. "It's showing the way," the woman whispered. The listener followed the glowing trace. It curved eastward, toward Samarkand, where rumor said a monastery held the last library that could read the tongues of stars. But the line didn't stop there. It bent again, looping west, touching the ruins of Palmyra, then down toward Alexandria, where scrolls had once burned like suns. And finally, it pointed not outward, but downward, into the very ground beneath them. The listener hesitated. Down? The woman nodded, her expression unreadable. "Maybe the map isn't leading us somewhere," she said softly. "Maybe it's remembering where something was buried." The light flickered, trembled, and then steadied. The listener reached forward, fingertips barely grazing the edge of the seal. A shock passed through him, cold, clean, endless. For a heartbeat, he saw everything. Empires rising like breaths, falling like sighs. Men carving their names into stone only for sand to polish them away. Languages born, dying, reborn in others' mouths.
And through it all, the same line, winding, bright, eternal. The road that never ended, only forgot itself for a while. When he came back to breath, the fire had dimmed. The woman watched him. "What did it show you?" she asked. He swallowed. "That every word we speak," he said slowly, "is just the desert trying to remember itself." The wind exhaled once, as if in agreement. He folded the scroll again, and this time it made a sound, a sigh, unmistakably human.
Night came without ceremony. The fire had long died, and the air was the color of breath. The listener sat alone while the others slept, the scroll now silent beneath his hands. The stars returned, patient, unashamed, the same ones that had watched caravans for 1,000 years. In their company, the desert felt older than sorrow. He unrolled the parchment once more, not to read, but to listen. Nothing stirred. The ink had cooled into stillness. The Tang seal no longer glowed. Yet the silence around it was not empty, it was full, as though the night itself were waiting to be named. He remembered the vision the map had shown him. Empires collapsing into dust, words turning to wind, and the single golden thread that tied them all. He could not tell whether what he had seen was history, prophecy, or simply the mind of the desert dreaming aloud. The woman's words came back to him. Maybe it's remembering where something was buried. He looked at the sand before him and realized it wasn't the ground that hid the secret, it was time. Time had buried the truth beneath years, beneath retellings, beneath the vanity of rulers who believed memory belonged to them. He felt the map of ash against his chest, warm again, and beneath it the Tang scroll, cool as bone. Between them, his heart beat like a drum that didn't know which rhythm to follow, the living or the lost. A faint breeze rose, shifting a veil of sand. Under the moonlight, he thought he saw patterns, the ghost of paths the storm had erased, leading outward in all directions, or inward to the same point, here. The desert was not trying to hide, it was teaching him how to look. He picked up a stick and traced one of the glowing lines he half remembered from the map, a spiral of sound rather than distance. At its center, he wrote nothing, only paused, letting the wind erase it. If silence can remember, then I will learn to listen without asking. He closed his eyes, and from somewhere deep, perhaps beneath the dunes, perhaps within his own ribs, came the echo of that vow he had half forgotten in the storm. Carry us. His breath slowed. The desert breathed with him. The woman stirred in her sleep, murmuring something in a language too old to guess. For a heartbeat, the Tang seal flickered again, one pulse like a dying star, then went dark forever. He smiled, not in victory, but in understanding. There would be no treasure, no revelation, no end. The map had never been meant to lead him anywhere but back, to the place where words, silence, and memory began as one. He rolled the scroll gently, placed it beside the sleeping fire, and looked east where the horizon barely glowed with the promise of another day. He whispered to the wind, perhaps this was what they had been hiding all along. The wind, kind, ancient, amused, gave no answer.
It only carried his question forward into the dark. And as he lay back on the cooling sand, the listener felt the two maps beating softly together against his chest, the ash and the word, the silence and the voice, until they became, for that brief, unbroken moment before sleep, the same thing.
The desert had learned silence again. After the storm, after the whispers of maps and empires, the night returned, wide, velvet, and kind. The sand lay smooth as the skin of an old instrument, tuned by centuries of wind. Overhead, the stars scattered like spilt salt, infinite, yet unhurried. They shone not for witness, but for comfort. The listener sat beside the remains of the fire, where embers glowed faintly like eyes half closed in thought. The others had drifted into sleep, one by one, each wrapped in the language of their own breath. The Persian boy murmured softly in a tongue that might have been a prayer or a dream. The woman in indigo lay on her side, her veil loosened, the blue shard at her neck catching the starlight like a piece of frozen dawn. Even the scarred man, who had feared the quiet more than death, now slept with his hand open against the sand. The camels rested nearby, their bodies curved into the dunes, their shadows long and still. A bell on one of their necks gave a faint, irregular chime whenever the wind moved, a sound so small it seemed the desert itself was breathing through it. The listener looked east, toward where Samarkand would rise when the sun returned. He thought of its domes, turquoise, shining like thought made solid, and of the voices that would fill its markets at dawn. But tonight, the world did not need voices. Tonight, even memory deserved to rest. He took the two scrolls from his cloak, the map of ash and the tang parchment. Both were silent now. Their warmth faded, but he could feel a pulse between them still, faint like two hearts keeping time across sleep. He placed them side by side in the sand and drew a small circle around them with his finger, then whispered, "Rest too." The wind carried his words away without sound. He leaned back, his head resting on the folded saddle, eyes open to the sky. For the first time since the storm, his body felt heavy in a way that meant peace. The stars did not blink, they breathed. Somewhere beyond them, beyond the thin line between waking and dream, he imagined the road continuing, still curving across unseen lands, still humming with the footsteps of those yet to come. He thought of the caravan as part of that endless road, not the beginning, not the end, but the pause between two breaths. The air cooled. The dunes shimmered faintly, silvered by moonlight. A faint scent of sandalwood and ashes lingered, mingling with the salt of the wind. And beneath it all, the deep, unbroken rhythm of the desert's heart. Slow, patient, eternal, like the sound of sleep beginning. The listener closed his eyes.
For a long while, nothing changed. The world held its breath with him, as if afraid to wake him too soon.
The fire had become a single coal, no larger than an eye, no brighter than a memory. It breathed softly, shrinking with every sigh of wind. The listener watched it as one might watch a friend depart, without words, only gratitude. Every flame that had burned tonight had been borrowed from something else, from wood that once lived, from breath that once prayed, from time that once promised warmth. Now, as it faded, it was returning all that it had taken. The shadows around him shifted, softer now, as if the dunes themselves had come closer to listen. A faint rustle, a camel moving in sleep, the whisper of a loose strap, the sigh of cooling metal. The night was full of small, merciful sounds. The listener reached for his water skin, took one careful sip, and poured the rest over the coal. It hissed, a sound like a question ending, and then there was only the dark. For a moment, he could not tell if his eyes were open or closed. The stars floated above him like seeds waiting for wind. The woman in indigo stirred, turning toward him without waking. Her face was calm, the lines of travel smoothed away by sleep. The shard at her throat flickered once, then went still. The boy murmured something about home. The listener smiled. There was no home but the road, and no road but the one that leads inward. He looked down at his hands, palms dusted with light, and thought of the two maps resting between them. Not scrolls anymore, but memories given shape, the desert's way of writing. He placed one hand over his heart. Beneath his fingers, he could feel both the weight and the stillness of what he carried. Somewhere in the distance, an owl cried. Somewhere closer, sand slid in slow rhythm, as if the earth were turning in its sleep. The listener whispered into the dark, "The world keeps breathing, even when we stop." His voice was so low that even he barely heard it. But the wind did. It rose gently, curling around him, tracing the edges of his cloak. And for the briefest instant, he thought it answered back, not in words, but in temperature, in the soft exhale of warmth against his cheek. He smiled again, eyes half open. The fire was gone now, but its light lingered in memory. In that faint afterglow, he saw the caravan as it must look from above. Small lights once moving, now stilled. A pattern the stars themselves could understand. Perhaps the road was a language too, written not in ink or sand, but in distance shared by travelers who never meet twice the same way. His body grew heavy, his breath slower. The desert hummed around him, its voice deep, steady, kind. He lay back against the dune and let the sound carry him, part wind, part earth, part the memory of flame. The listener's last thought before sleep was not of the storm, nor of the map, nor of Samarkand. It was of a single bell on a camel's neck, ringing gently in the dark, reminding the night that all things still move, even in rest. The desert no longer needed to speak. It hummed softly, like the inside of a seashell, endless but gentle. Above, the sky bent close enough to listen. The stars, still and bright,
seemed to draw their light slower now, as if they too were beginning to sleep. The listener's breath fell into rhythm with the dunes, slow and deep. Somewhere, the last bell swayed once, a single note folding into the night. The sound lingered, then melted into quiet. All that remained was warmth. The wind moved through the camp with the tenderness of a mother tucking children into bed. It touched each sleeper, the boy's shoulder, the woman's veil, the listener's hands, then went on, carrying their dreams across the sands. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, nothing needed to be remembered. The road could rest. The stories could rest. Even the stars could close their eyes. The listener's face softened. He dreamed, not of maps or storms, but of calm horizons. He saw the road again, stretching under moonlight, unbroken. Yet this time, no one walked it. The road breathed on its own, alive, complete, waiting for morning. The fire's ashes cooled into patterns the wind would erase by dawn. One by one, the sounds of the camp faded. The sigh of a rope, the rustle of a blanket, the tiny pulse of sand shifting under weight. The desert returned to its oldest truth, stillness. And so, as the storyteller's voice falls low and slow, you may feel the same peace. Breathe in the silence of the dunes. Let your body rest like the caravans beneath the stars. The journey is done for tonight. The maps have closed their eyes. Now, let the desert keep its secrets. Let the stars guard your dreams. Let the wind carry every thought away until only calm remains. Sleep, traveler. The Silk Road is quiet now.